The morning sun cast a golden hue over the bustling city streets, but for Elijah Carter, the day's calm was misleading. Dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, the black man moved confidently through the world that often underestimated him. A well-respected senator and a vocal advocate for racial equality, Elijah was accustomed to carrying himself with grace in situations others would find insurmountable. His deep-set eyes scanned the horizon as he walked to his car, a black sedan parked along the quiet edges of a residential block. Just as Elijah reached for the door, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Hey you! What are you doing here?" Elijah turned, his brow furrowing slightly as a young pale-faced officer in a crisp uniform approached with rapid strides. The rookie's hand rested on the hilt of his holstered weapon, his body radiating a tense energy that didn't match the peaceful surroundings. Elijah straightened his posture, exuding calm, despite the undercurrent of unease building in his chest. "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was steady, but tinged with curiosity. "I need to see some ID," the rookie demanded, his tone clipped. "This neighborhood doesn't usually see people like you." The air between them thickened with an unspoken tension, the officer's words cutting sharper than the blaring sirens in the distance. Elijah remained poised, though his grip on his briefcase tightened ever so slightly. Stay with us to find out how this unexpected encounter spirals into a confrontation that will leave you speechless. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. The city pulsed with life, its rhythm a blend of car horns, hurried footsteps, and murmured conversations. Elijah Carter had always loved these sounds. They were a reminder of the community he served and the diversity he fought to protect. Today, however, he had opted for a quieter corner of town, away from the downtown chaos. The tree-lined streets were dotted with charming suburban homes, each radiating an air of quiet affluence. Elijah had spent the morning meeting with grassroots organizers, brainstorming ways to address inequities in housing and education. These meetings, though draining, were what fueled him. He had grown up in neighborhoods like the ones he now fought for, where opportunity seemed like a distant dream. As the son of a teacher and a factory worker, Elijah had learned early on that dignity was something you demanded, not something freely given. His rise to the Senate had been hard-fought, filled with battles against institutional bias and personal doubt. But Elijah never wavered. His voice had become a beacon for those who had been silenced for too long. His presence in politics, in rooms often devoid of faces like his, was itself a statement. Yet, even with his achievements, there were moments that reminded him how far society still had to go. Today was supposed to be uneventful, a brief reprieve before the whirlwind of campaigning picked up again. As he parked his car along a peaceful street and stepped out, he inhaled deeply, letting the fresh scent of pine mingle with the crisp morning air. Elijah was meeting an old friend who lived just a few blocks away. The thought of seeing someone who knew him before the titles and accolades brought a rare smile to his face. But just as Elijah turned toward the sidewalk, he caught sight of a police cruiser rounding the corner. It was a fleeting glance, nothing out of the ordinary, yet it stirred something inside him, a familiar unease. Elijah shook it off. He had no reason to feel anything but pride walking these streets. After all, he was a senator, a man of the people. The rookie officer driving the cruiser, however, had a different perspective. Officer Ethan Moore had only been on the force for 6 months. Young and eager to prove himself, he often overcompensated, wielding his badge like armor in every encounter. Ethan had grown up in a small, predominantly white town, where the idea of law and order was as ingrained as Sunday church service. The academy had trained him to spot potential threats, and his narrow worldview had filled in the rest. When Ethan saw Elijah standing by the car, something in him stirred a misplaced suspicion fueled by bias. The neighborhood was affluent, predominantly white, and Elijah, in his sharp suit and calm demeanor, didn't fit the profile. Ethan slowed his cruiser, his eyes narrowing as he watched the man open the car door. The rookie had already made up his mind. To him, this wasn't just a man going about his day, it was a potential threat that needed addressing. "This is my chance," Ethan thought, his heart pounding with the rush of adrenaline. As Elijah retrieved his briefcase from the car, he noticed the cruiser slowing to a stop just a few feet away. The officer stepped out, his boots crunching against the asphalt with an assertiveness that couldn't be ignored. "Excuse me, sir," Ethan called out, his hand hovering near his belt. "Can I have a word with you?" Elijah turned to face the officer, his expression calm but wary. "Of course," he replied. Ethan's eyes darted from the car to Elijah's briefcase and back again. "Do you live around here?" he asked, his tone laced with an authority that felt less like a question and more like a demand. "No," Elijah replied, his voice measured. "I'm visiting a friend who lives nearby." The response seemed to agitate Ethan. "Do you have any ID on you?" Elijah raised an eyebrow, not out of defiance but curiosity. "Is there a reason you're asking, officer?" Ethan straightened his posture, as if trying to assert dominance. We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area, he lied, his voice firm. Just routine questioning. Elijah sighed inwardly. He had encountered this scenario more times than he cared to remember, stopped for existing in spaces deemed off-limits by unspoken rules. Still, he had no intention of escalating the situation. Of course, he said, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his wallet. I'm Senator Elijah Carter. Here's my ID. Ethan's eyes widened for a brief moment before narrowing again. He glanced at the ID, his mind racing. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. The title on the card stared back at him, U.S. Senator. Yet, his ingrained biases overpowered his logic. Senator, Ethan said, his tone skeptical. What's a senator doing around here? Elijah took a slow breath, keeping his composure. As I said, I'm visiting a friend. The rookie officer's gaze hardened, his grip on his belt tightening. Well, you're acting awfully suspicious. Maybe you should come with me to the station until we can verify this. Elijah blinked, momentarily stunned by the audacity of the suggestion. Officer, I've done nothing wrong, he replied firmly, though his voice remained calm. And I'm certainly not going anywhere without cause. The tension crackled between them like static electricity. A small crowd had started to gather at a distance, curious but hesitant to intervene. Among them was a middle-aged woman walking her dog, her face a mask of concern. Ethan's jaw tightened as he felt the eyes of the onlookers. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down, even as doubt began to creep into his mind. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for obstruction. Elijah's heart sank, not from fear, but from the crushing weight of the moment. He had spent his life fighting for equality, for the idea that no one should be judged by the color of their skin. Yet here he was, reduced to a suspect in the eyes of someone sworn to uphold the law. He straightened his shoulders, his voice steady and resolute. Do what you have to do, officer, he said. But understand this, you're making a grave mistake. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, Elijah's calm yet authoritative words slicing through the chaos in his mind. The rookie officer's hand lingered near his holstered weapon, a subconscious act born of tension rather than necessity. He was losing control of the situation. He could feel it slipping through his fingers, the steady gaze of Elijah Carter undermining his shaky resolve. I'm going to need you to place your hands on the car, Sir Ethan demanded, his voice sharp yet quivering under the weight of his inexperience. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his posture exuding composure even as the tension in the air thickened. His voice was calm but firm, like a seasoned professor correcting an over-eager student. Officer, I've already complied with your request to identify myself. I've done nothing wrong. What exactly do you believe gives you the authority to detain me further? Ethan's pulse quickened, and for a fleeting moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. He could feel the weight of the growing crowd's gaze on him, their whispers a low hum of judgment. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He clenched his jaw, his hand twitching near his belt. That's for me to determine, Ethan replied curtly, his tone clipped. Now, I won't ask again. Step to the car and place your hands where I can see them. Elijah remained motionless, his steady gaze never wavering. The hint of a sigh escaped his lips, but his stance betrayed no fear. He wasn't simply defying an unjust demand, he was making a statement, one rooted in a lifetime of understanding what it meant to be misjudged for the color of his skin. The onlookers, now numbering at least a dozen, began to inch closer, their murmurs growing louder. Why is he doing this to him? A young woman whispered, her phone aimed squarely at the confrontation. That guy hasn't done anything wrong. Ethan's eyes darted toward the crowd, the sight of multiple phones recording every moment setting his nerves on edge. He felt the walls closing in, the spotlight brighter than he'd ever imagined. This wasn't how he'd envisioned his career, a rising star on the force, praised for his dedication and instincts. Instead, he felt like a caged animal, exposed and vulnerable. Elijah took a slow step forward, raising his hand slightly to diffuse the tension. Officer, he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. I understand you're doing your job, but your job also requires you to uphold the law. There's nothing lawful about this. I've provided my identification. I've explained my presence here. What more do you need? Ethan's face flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and anger. He opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by the sharp crackle of his radio. Unit 34, report your status, the dispatcher's voice came through, calm but insistent. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, his fingers fumbling with the radio. He raised it to his lips, his voice uneven. Unit 34, conducting a routine stop. Suspect is non-compliant. The word suspect hung in the air like a foul stench. Elijah's jaw tightened, the familiar sting of indignity coursing through him. He had spent decades fighting for dignity and equality, And yet here he was, reduced to a single word that erased his identity, his achievements, his humanity. Elijah took another measured breath, his eyes locked on Ethan's. "I am not a suspect," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I am a United States Senator, and your actions today will have consequences far beyond this street." The rookie stiffened at the words, his pride clashing with the growing weight of the situation. He could feel the tension in the crowd escalating, their whispers turning into audible exclamations of disbelief and outrage. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of screeching tires broke through the thick atmosphere. A second police cruiser pulled up to the scene, its flashing lights reflecting off nearby windows. The crowd shifted, their attention now divided between the confrontation and the arrival of another officer. Sergeant Daniel Hayes stepped out of the vehicle, his tall frame exuding an air of authority and control. A seasoned veteran with over 2 decades of experience, Hayes had seen more than his share of tense situations. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the crowd, the flustered rookie, and the composed man standing by the car. "What's going on here?" Hayes asked, his tone neutral but edged with curiosity. He approached the scene with measured steps, his presence immediately commanding respect. Ethan straightened his posture, his voice trembling slightly as he responded. "This man was acting suspiciously near his vehicle," he said, gesturing toward Elijah. "I asked for ID, and he's refusing to cooperate." Hayes raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to Elijah. His experienced eyes took in the tailored suit, the calm demeanor, the briefcase. Something about the rookie's assessment didn't sit right. "Sir," Hayes said, addressing Elijah directly, "may I ask your name?" Elijah reached into his pocket and retrieved his wallet, handing over his ID with deliberate care. "Elijah Carter," he said evenly. "United States Senator." The sergeant's eyes widened slightly as he studied the ID, recognition dawning on his face. He glanced back at Ethan, then at the crowd before returning his attention to Elijah. "Senator Carter," Hayes said, his tone shifting to one of respect. "I apologize for any misunderstanding. Are you all right?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but pointed. "I'm unharmed, Sergeant," he replied. "But this situation is far from a misunderstanding. Your officer saw a black man in a neighborhood he didn't think I belonged in and decided I was a threat. My title shouldn't be what protects me from this kind of harassment." Hayes's face hardened as he turned to Ethan, who now looked as though the ground beneath him might swallow him whole. "Officer Moore," Hayes said, his voice low and firm, "do you understand what you've done?" Ethan stammered, his words catching in his throat. I thought." "You didn't think," Hayes interrupted, his tone sharp. "You acted on an assumption, and that assumption could have cost this department dearly." The crowd murmured louder, their phones still recording every moment. Elijah stood silent, his expression unreadable as he observed the unfolding scene. Hayes stepped closer to the rookie, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've embarrassed this department. You've embarrassed yourself. I suggest you think very carefully about your next words." Ethan's mouth opened and closed, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't come. The weight of his actions bore down on him like a crushing tide, the realization of his mistake settling deep in his chest. Elijah, seeing the rookie's growing distress, took a step forward. His voice was calm but commanding, carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating moments like this. "Officer Moore," he said, drawing Ethan's attention, "ignorance is something that can be remedied with education. Arrogance, however, requires effort to unlearn. I suggest you start that effort today." The rookie looked at Elijah, his face pale, his pride shattered. For the first time, he truly saw the man before him not as a suspect, but as a leader, a symbol, and someone far beyond his narrow assumptions. Ethan's breathing grew shallow, his mind spinning as Elijah's words hung in the air. The weight of the moment was suffocating, amplified by the crowd's murmurs and the unwavering gaze of Sergeant Hayes. The rookie's fingers twitched near his belt, his instinct to assert control clashing with the stark realization that he had overstepped in a way that couldn't be undone. "Sergeant, I didn't mean to." I thought Ethan's words trailed off, his voice faltering under Hayes's cold, steady glare. "You thought what Hayes demanded," his voice low but cutting. "That you could make a baseless stop and hope no one would notice? That this man, a United States Senator, wouldn't push back against your nonsense?" Ethan's shoulders sagged, his earlier bravado crumbling as his superior continued. "You need to understand something more," Hayes said, gesturing toward Elijah. "This isn't just a PR disaster waiting to happen. This is exactly the kind of behavior that destroys trust between law enforcement and the communities we're supposed to serve." The crowd edged closer, emboldened by the sergeant's words. Phones captured every moment, and a few voices called out from the sidelines. "That rookie should be fired," a middle-aged man shouted. "How's he even on the force?" Ethan's face burned with humiliation as Hayes raised a hand to silence the onlookers. Turning back to Elijah, the sergeant's expression softened, though his tone remained professional. "Senator Carter," Hayes began, "I deeply regret the way this situation has unfolded. I assure you this is not representative of how we operate as a department." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "Sergeant Hayes," he said calmly, "I'd like to believe that. But let's not pretend this is an isolated incident. This isn't about one rookie's poor judgment. It's about a system that enables these assumptions to persist." The crowd nodded in agreement, murmurs of "he's right" rippling through the group. Ethan flinched at the senator's words, each one landing like a blow to his already bruised pride. His mind raced with excuses, but none seemed sufficient to explain his actions. Hayes's jaw tightened. He knew Elijah was right. As a veteran officer, he had seen the cracks in the system firsthand. His loyalty to the badge often clashed with the harsh realities of the institution it represented. "You're not wrong," Senator Hayes admitted, his voice heavy with resignation. "But that doesn't excuse what happened here today. I'll make sure this is addressed." Elijah gave a small nod, though his expression remained guarded. "Addressing it means more than an apology, Sergeant," he said. "It means accountability and change. Without those, we'll be having this conversation again tomorrow, and the day after that." Ethan's head hung low as the conversation unfolded around him, the gravity of his actions pressing down like a weight he couldn't lift. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of his mistake, not just the immediate consequences, but the broader implications of what he had done. As the sergeant turned back toward the rookie, his voice hardened. "More," Hayes said. "You're done here for today. Turn in your badge and head back to the station. We'll discuss this further when I return." Ethan's head shot up, his mouth opening to protest, but the look in Hayes's eyes silenced him. Numbly, he reached for his badge, unclipping it from his uniform and placing it in Hayes's outstretched hand. The crowd watched silently, the tension in the air thick with a mix of vindication and unease. Elijah stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the silence. "Officer Moore," he said, his tone measured, "I hope you take this experience and learn from it. Mistakes are forgivable, but only if they lead to growth. The next time you see someone who doesn't look like they belong, ask yourself why you feel that way. Challenge those assumptions." Ethan met Elijah's gaze for the first time, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and something that resembled gratitude. He gave a small nod before turning and walking toward his cruiser, his steps heavy with the weight of humiliation. As the rookie drove away, the tension began to dissipate, replaced by a somber stillness. Hayes turned back to Elijah, his expression apologetic. "Senator, I'd like to personally escort you to your destination," he offered, his tone respectful. Elijah hesitated, glancing toward the crowd that still lingered. "I appreciate the offer, Sergeant," he said, "but I'd rather finish my walk. It's important that I be seen as I am a man, not just a senator." Hayes nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "I'll stay nearby, just in case," he said. Elijah extended a hand, which Hayes shook firmly. "Thank you for stepping in," Sergeant Elijah said. "But remember, stepping in after the damage is done isn't enough. Prevention is what truly builds trust." As Elijah turned and began walking down the street, the crowd parted to let him pass. A woman holding a young child stepped forward, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "Thank you, Senator," she said, "for standing up for yourself. And for all of us." Elijah offered her a small, warm smile. "It's my duty," he said simply before continuing on his way. The murmurs of the crowd faded behind him as he walked, his mind turning over the events of the past half hour. It wasn't the first time he had been misjudged, and it wouldn't be the last. But each encounter, each moment of resistance, was a reminder of why he fought so hard for justice. At the same time, Elijah couldn't shake the rookie's face from his mind, the mix of arrogance and vulnerability, the quick unraveling of confidence when the truth became undeniable. The senator knew that change wouldn't come from punishment alone. It would come from education, from breaking down the walls of ignorance one brick at a time. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A few taps later, he had drafted a quick message to his staff to schedule a meeting with the local precinct leadership. "I want to discuss community training initiatives. We can't let this happen again." Sliding the phone back into his pocket, Elijah took a deep breath. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it never was. Change was slow, painful, and often met with resistance. But moments like these, moments where the truth was laid bare for all to see, were the catalysts that sparked transformation. As he turned the corner toward his friend's house, Elijah's steps felt a little lighter. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. The day had unfolded into a storm Elijah Carter hadn't anticipated, but the weight of his life's experiences had prepared him to navigate its turbulence. As he turned the corner onto the narrow, tree-lined street leading to his friend's house, his thoughts churned. The encounter with Officer Moore was over, but the implications lingered, heavy and unyielding. His calm exterior belied the frustration simmering within. A sudden, sharp sound shattered the quiet tires screeching against asphalt. Elijah turned instinctively, his pulse quickening as the rookie's cruiser reappeared, barreling down the street toward him. A knot tightened in his chest. Why was Ethan back? What could he possibly want now? The car skidded to a halt mere feet away, the metallic creak of the brakes slicing through the tense silence. Elijah's eyes locked onto Ethan as the rookie stepped out, his movements jerky, his expression a volatile mix of desperation and defiance. Senator Carter Ethan's voice cracked, loud and unsteady. The tension in his frame was palpable, his fists clenched at his sides. Elijah froze, every instinct telling him to remain calm, measured. "Officer Moore," he said, his voice even. "What are you doing here? I thought this matter was resolved." Ethan took a step closer, his jaw tight, his face flushed. "No, it's not resolved," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "You don't understand. I can't let this end like this. You've made me look like a fool, like I don't belong on this force. Do you have any idea what this will do to my career?" Elijah's brows furrowed, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "Officer Moore, this isn't about your career," he replied firmly. "It's about accountability, about ensuring that this never happens again." The rookie shook his head violently, his breaths coming in short bursts. "No," he snapped. "This is about you thinking you're better than me. Just because you're a senator doesn't mean you can treat me like I'm nothing." Elijah's composure faltered briefly, the sheer audacity of the statement catching him off guard. He took a deliberate step forward, his voice sharp yet restrained. "Officer Moore, I've treated you with respect throughout this encounter. If you feel like nothing, that's something you need to confront within yourself, not project onto me." Ethan's face twisted with frustration. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't get it," he shouted, his voice cracking. "People like me. We're just trying to do our jobs, but people like you always make it harder." Elijah's jaw tightened at the veiled implication, the words "people like you" hitting with the force of a hammer. His heart pounded, but he refused to let his anger dictate his actions. Instead, he straightened his posture, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to battles like this. "Officer Moore," he said, each word deliberate, "you're dangerously close to crossing a line you can't come back from. You need to take a breath, step away, and think very carefully about what you say and do next." But Ethan wasn't listening. His desperation had morphed into recklessness, his body language jittery and tense. The rookie's hand moved to his belt, hovering near his holstered firearm, a gesture that sent a chill through Elijah. "Officer Moore," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm, "I suggest you remove your hand from your weapon. Right now." The words hung in the air, a sharp warning that cut through the haze of Ethan's spiraling emotions. For a brief moment, the rookie hesitated, the reality of the situation flickering in his eyes. But the weight of his own insecurity, the humiliation of being called out in front of his peers, pushed him further into his downward spiral. "I'm not going to let you ruin me," Ethan said, his voice trembling. His fingers gripped the handle of his firearm, the movement sending shockwaves through the charged atmosphere. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest, the potential for violence now a stark reality. His voice remained steady, unwavering. "Ethan," he said, for the first time using the rookie's first name, "listen to me. Whatever you're feeling right now, anger, humiliation, fear, it doesn't have to define you. Put the weapon down, and we can figure this out together." The sound of another car approaching pierced the tension. Both men turned as Sergeant Hayes's cruiser rolled into view, its flashing lights casting ominous shadows across the narrow street. Hayes stepped out quickly, his hand resting on his own firearm, though he didn't draw it. His sharp eyes took in the scene, immediately the rookie's trembling hand on his weapon, the senator's composed but guarded stance. Moore Hayes barked, his voice sharp and commanding, "Stand down. Right now." Ethan flinched at the sergeant's tone, his grip loosening slightly but not enough to release the weapon. "He's trying to destroy me," Sarge Ethan said, his voice desperate. "He's making me out to be the bad guy." Hayes took a cautious step forward, his tone softening but still firm. "Nobody's trying to destroy you, Ethan. But you're about to make a mistake that will ruin everything, not just your career but your life. Let go of the gun." Elijah remained still, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "This is your moment, Officer Moore," he said softly. "You get to choose who you become after this. Don't let this choice define you in the wrong way." Ethan's breathing grew heavier, his hand trembling visibly now. The tension was suffocating, every second stretching into an eternity as the three men stood locked in a standoff that could shift with a single movement. The standoff felt like time had frozen, each second dragging painfully under the weight of what might happen next. Ethan's hand hovered dangerously close to his firearm, his chest heaving as the gravity of his choices pressed down on him. Sergeant Hayes stood poised, his voice calm but edged with urgency, while Elijah remained steady, his eyes locked on the rookie with an unflinching gaze. Ethan Hayes said again, his tone softer now, like a parent coaxing a frightened child, "Look at me. You're not thinking clearly. You don't want to do this." The rookie's eyes darted between Hayes and Elijah, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions: fear, anger, humiliation. "He made me look like a joke," Sarge Ethan muttered, his voice breaking. "In front of everyone. How am I supposed to come back from that?" Hayes took a cautious step closer, his hands visible and palms raised in a gesture of reassurance. "Listen to me," he said firmly. "We've all made mistakes. I've been in your shoes feeling like the whole world is against you. But this isn't the way to fix it. Put the gun down, and we'll handle this together." Ethan's grip tightened momentarily, his fingers twitching around the handle of the firearm. The crowd from earlier had mostly dispersed, but a few people lingered at a distance, their phones still recording. The rookie felt their eyes on him, amplifying the shame that burned in his chest. Elijah, sensing the mounting pressure, stepped in. His voice was steady, measured, and filled with a quiet authority that cut through the tension like a knife. "Ethan," he said, using the rookie's first name once more, "you're not the only one under scrutiny here. Every decision I make is watched, questioned, criticized. But the mark of a person's character isn't how they avoid mistakes, it's how they take responsibility for them." Ethan's eyes flickered to Elijah, the senator's words striking a chord somewhere deep beneath the layers of anger and defensiveness. For the first time, the rookie's hand wavered, inching away from the firearm. "You don't understand what it's like," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I worked so hard to get here, to prove I belonged. And now it's all falling apart." Elijah's expression softened slightly, though his posture remained firm. "I do understand," he said. "More than you realize. I've had to prove myself every single day of my life to people who doubted me, dismissed me, disrespected me. But letting anger consume you only leads to regret." Hayes seized on the shift in Ethan's demeanor, stepping closer until he was just a few feet away. "More," he said, his voice low but commanding. "This is your chance to make things right. Take your hand off the gun, and let's talk. Nobody's beyond redemption, but you have to take the first step." The rookie's hand finally fell away from the firearm, his shoulders slumping as though a great weight had been lifted. The tension in the air eased slightly, though it was far from gone. Hayes exhaled quietly, a subtle sign of relief, as he moved closer and gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did the right thing," Hayes said softly, his tone carrying a note of reassurance. "But this isn't over. You've got a lot to answer for, and it's going to be hard. But you can get through it if you're willing to listen and learn." Ethan nodded weakly, his head hanging low. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by a heavy silence that spoke of regret and shame. Hayes turned to Elijah, his expression a mix of gratitude and respect. "Senator Carter," he said, his voice steady, "thank you for keeping your composure. This could have gone very differently, and it's because of you that it didn't." Elijah gave a small nod, though his face betrayed little emotion. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, "I appreciate your intervention. But let's not lose sight of the larger issue. This wasn't just a rookie making a mistake. This was the result of a system that needs reform." Hayes met Elijah's gaze, his jaw tightening. "I hear you, Senator," he said, "and I'll do what I can to address it." Elijah's eyes softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. "I'll hold you to that," he said, "because if we don't address the root of the problem, moments like this will keep happening. And next time, the outcome might not be so fortunate." The senator stepped back, adjusting his suit jacket as he prepared to leave. But before he turned away, he looked at Ethan one last time. "Officer Moore," he said, his tone carrying a weight that made the rookie look up, "this is your chance to reflect, to change. Don't waste it." Ethan nodded silently, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, he seemed to truly grasp the magnitude of his actions, not just for himself, but for the people he had sworn to serve. As Elijah walked away, Hayes guided Ethan back to his cruiser, the rookie moving with the slow, deliberate steps of someone carrying an invisible burden. The sergeant opened the car door for him, but before Ethan climbed in, he turned back to Hayes. "Do you think I can fix this?" Ethan asked quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. Hayes studied the young officer for a moment, then nodded. "If you're willing to put in the work," he said, "and if you're willing to listen, then yes. But it's not going to be easy." Ethan climbed into the car, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Hayes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before turning to Elijah, who stood watching from a distance. The senator's expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of resolve in his eyes, a determination to ensure that this moment would lead to something greater than just accountability for one officer. As Hayes returned to his cruiser, Elijah continued his walk down the street, his mind heavy with the events of the day. He had faced countless moments like this, each one a reminder of the deep-rooted biases and systemic issues that still plagued society. But this time felt different. This time there was a glimmer of hope, a chance, however small, for change. Walk to his friend's house was quiet, but Elijah Carter's thoughts were anything but. The street, with its charming homes and swaying trees, felt heavier now, weighed down by the echoes of what had just transpired. It wasn't the first time Elijah had faced prejudice, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But this moment, as personal as it had been, was just one chapter in a larger narrative, a narrative about a society still grappling with the scars of its past. When Elijah reached his destination, the sight of his friend's home brought a brief moment of solace. It was a modest but welcoming house, its porch adorned with potted plants and a wind chime that jingled softly in the breeze. He paused at the front steps, drawing a deep breath to center himself. The confrontation with Officer Moore had ended without physical violence, but the emotional toll lingered. The door opened before he could knock, and a warm smile greeted him. Elijah, his friend Marcus said, extending a hand. "I thought you'd be here sooner. What happened?" Elijah hesitated, the weight of the encounter settling more heavily on his shoulders now that he was no longer in the thick of it. "I'll explain inside," he said quietly, stepping past Marcus and into the comforting familiarity of the house. As they sat at the kitchen table, Elijah recounted the events of the day in detail. Marcus listened intently, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger and finally to a weary understanding. "You kept your composure," Marcus said, shaking his head. "I don't know how you do it, man. If it had been me, I don't think I could have stayed so calm." Elijah gave a small, tired smile. "Years of practice," he said. "Moments like that aren't new to me. But today was different. That rookie wasn't just acting out of ignorance, he was acting out of fear. And fear is dangerous in the hands of someone with power." Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Do you think he learned anything from this?" Elijah considered the question carefully. "I hope so," he said. "But change doesn't happen in a single moment. It's a process. It takes reflection, guidance, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." Marcus nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "And what about the department? Do you think Hayes will follow through?" Elijah's expression hardened slightly. "He doesn't have a choice," he said. "The whole thing was recorded. The public will demand accountability. But beyond that, I intend to make sure this isn't swept under the rug. This incident is part of a bigger conversation that we need to have not just in this city, but everywhere." Marcus smiled faintly, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "That's why you're the senator," he said. "You don't let anything slide." Elijah chuckled softly, the tension in his chest loosening ever so slightly. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about the people who don't have the platform I do. I'm their voice. And if I don't use it to speak out against injustice, then what's the point?" The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Outside, the wind chime jingled again, its soft melody a stark contrast to the heavy thoughts swirling in Elijah's mind. Later that evening, as Elijah walked back to his car, he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his team. "Draft a statement about today's incident. Emphasize the need for systemic reform and accountability in law enforcement. Schedule meetings with local leaders and the precinct by next week." He hit send, the resolve in his chest solidifying. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Moments like these were catalysts, opportunities to shine a light on the cracks in the system and push for meaningful change. When Elijah reached his car, he paused, leaning against the door as he gazed out at the quiet street. His mind replayed the events with a clarity that was both painful and necessary. Ethan Moore's face came to him again, the rookie's expression a mix of anger, fear, and in the end, regret. Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face. He didn't hate the young officer. In truth, he felt a strange kind of pity for him. Ethan was a product of the system. Elijah had spent his career trying to change a system that instilled fear and bias instead of understanding and empathy. Sliding into the driver's seat, Elijah started the car, the hum of the engine breaking the silence. As he pulled away from the curb, he couldn't help but think about the road ahead, both literally and figuratively. The journey toward justice was long and fraught with obstacles, but it was one he was committed to walking. At the precinct, Sergeant Hayes sat in his office, reviewing the incident report. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him. He glanced at Ethan's badge, now resting on his desk, a stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Hayes knew Elijah Carter was right. The problem wasn't just one rookie's mistake, it was a systemic issue that required more than apologies and reprimands. Picking up the phone, Hayes dialed the number for the precinct's training coordinator. "We need to schedule a department-wide training session," he said firmly. "Cultural sensitivity, de-escalation tactics, everything. I want it done within the month." Across the city, the few lingering witnesses to the day's events uploaded their videos to social media. Within hours, the footage had gone viral, sparking outrage and debate. Some praised Elijah's composure and Hayes' intervention, while others decried the fact that such an incident had occurred at all. For Elijah, the real work was just beginning. The next day, he stood before a room of reporters, his voice clear and resolute as he recounted the incident and called for comprehensive police reform. What happened yesterday wasn't just an isolated event, he said. It was a symptom of a larger problem, a problem that requires systemic change, not just individual accountability. The room buzzed with questions, but Elijah stayed focused, his message unwavering. He wasn't just speaking for himself, he was speaking for every person who had been judged, mistreated, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. As the press conference ended, Elijah felt a sense of resolve settle over him. This fight was far from over, but he was ready for it. The events of the previous day had been a stark reminder of why he had entered politics in the first place, to challenge the status quo and build a society rooted in justice and equality. Driving home that evening, Elijah glanced at the setting sun, its golden light casting a warm glow over the horizon. The road ahead was long, but he felt ready. Change wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and Elijah Carter was determined to see it through. As Elijah Carter drove home that evening, the day's events weighed heavily on his mind. The confrontation with Officer Moore, the systemic issues it symbolized, and the viral conversations sparked by the recordings were all reminders of the fight ahead. Yet, despite the challenges, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was never easy, and it often came at a high cost, but moments like these could ignite a fire that no one could ignore. The rookie officer had made a mistake, but Elijah knew he was just one part of a larger system that needed reform. The path forward would involve more than just addressing one incident. It would require tearing down barriers, fostering understanding, and ensuring accountability across all levels of society. As the city lights blurred past his window, Elijah made a silent vow to continue the fight for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been wrongfully judged or silenced. This was his mission, his responsibility, and he wouldn't back down. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring attention to the stories that matter most. Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear from you.